My name is Allison. I am 35 years old, and I spent the last 10 years keeping my family out of bankruptcy, only to be publicly discarded at my father's retirement gala. When he stood at the podium and handed my legacy to my incompetent sister and her scheming husband, he called me a glorified paper pusher with no vision. As security dragged me out of the Waldorf Astoria, to the sound of laughing billionaires, my mother simply sipped her champagne. What they did not know was that I owned the building, the company, and their entire future. I sent one text message, and 3 minutes later, my father lost everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to bury you. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers and the heavy scent of expensive perfume. I stood at the back of the massive room, adjusting the collar of my tailored black dress, my heart pounding with a mixture of profound exhaustion and quiet pride. My father Richard stood center stage under a bright, commanding spotlight. He was basking in the thunderous applause of Manhattan's corporate elite, flashing his signature charismatic smile that had fooled Wall Street for decades. For 10 grueling years, I was the invisible financial architect behind Vanguard Holdings. While Richard played golf at exclusive country clubs and bought luxury vintage cars he could not actually afford, I was the one untangling his disastrous financial messes. I sacrificed my 20s, my personal relationships, and my peace of mind to quietly restructure our massive logistics empire so the banks would not seize our assets. Tonight was supposed to be the night he finally acknowledged my sacrifices and officially named me his successor. The applause faded as Richard leaned into the microphone. He spoke grandly about his legacy, about building an empire from the ground up, completely ignoring the absolute fact that I had saved that very empire from total ruin 3 separate times. Then came the moment of truth. He announced that it was time to pass the torch to the next generation. I took a deep breath, preparing to walk forward and take my rightful place. Instead, his voice boomed across the vaulted ceilings, proudly welcoming the new co-chief executive officers of Vanguard Holdings, his beautiful daughter Natalie, and his brilliant son-in-law Jamal. My stomach plummeted into a cold, bottomless void. I watched as my younger sister Natalie glided onto the stage, wearing a custom designer gown, paid for by my strategic corporate budget cuts. Natalie had never worked a full 40-hour week in her entire life. She spent her days at luxury spas and her nights complaining to our mother about how exhausting it was to maintain a wealthy lifestyle. Right behind her was her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a charismatic vice president of sales, a master of schmoozing high-value clients and making grand, empty promises, but he could not read a basic balance sheet if his life depended on it. He had married into our family specifically for the corporate power and the massive paycheck, and I knew for a fact he was actively scheming behind the scenes to push me out of the executive suite entirely. Jamal wrapped his arm tightly around Natalie, flashing a perfect, arrogant smile for the flashing cameras of the business press. Richard raised his hand to quiet the cheering crowd. He looked directly over the sea of elegant tables, his eyes locking right onto me standing alone at the back of the room. A cruel, condescending smirk played on his lips. He leaned into the microphone and told the crowd that he knew some people might be wondering about his eldest daughter, Allison. His tone dripped with fake, sickening pity. He told hundreds of our investors and partners that I had been a dutiful, quiet employee in the accounting department, but that running a global empire requires bold vision and magnetic star power. He actually chuckled into the microphone and branded me a glorified paper pusher who lacks the vision for true leadership. He said I was great with a calculator, but I simply did not have what it takes to steer the family ship into the future. The silence in the ballroom was sudden, heavy, and completely deafening. I could feel the eyes of the board members and investors turning to look at me, the very people I had personally negotiated with to save this company's credit rating. Whispers broke out among the tables. The humiliation burned hot and sharp in my chest, but I adamantly refused to shrink away or shed a single tear. I had spent a decade being the designated family scapegoat, the quiet workhorse who fixed their careless mistakes while they eagerly stole the credit. I was entirely done being invisible. I stepped forward, my heels clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. I walked straight down the center aisle toward the brightly lit stage. The crowd parted around me as if I were contagious. I stopped at the edge of the stage looking up at the three of them standing securely behind the podium. I kept my voice perfectly steady, projecting it across the quiet room so that the front rows could hear every single word I said. I told my father that he and I both knew this company would have folded 3 years ago without my financial restructuring. I pointed directly at my sister and stated clearly that Natalie was entirely incompetent and possessed no understanding of our supply chain, and I pointed at Jamal, adding loudly that he had been systematically falsifying his executive expense reports to fund his lavish personal vacations. The crowd gasped in dramatic unison. Jamal clenched his jaw, his smooth, charismatic smile faltering into a look of genuine venomous hatred for a split second before he forced his composure back. Natalie let out a dramatic, exaggerated gasp, clutching her husband's arm as if I had just physically attacked her. Richard did not try to argue the financial facts. He did not defend his choices or the integrity of his company. He simply looked down at me with absolute unmasked disdain and snapped his fingers sharply in the air. Immediately, two massive security guards stepped out from the heavy velvet curtains at the edge of the stage. They marched heavily down the steps, grabbed me roughly by both of my arms, and began dragging me backward down the long center aisle. I struggled fiercely against their grip, demanding they let me go and take their hands off me, but they treated me like a violent trespasser who had snuck into the building. As I was forcefully pulled past the front VIP tables, I made direct eye contact with my mother, Patricia. She was sitting comfortably in her immaculate evening gown surrounded by her wealthy socialite friends and country club peers. She did not flinch. She did not intervene to help her own flesh and blood. She simply raised her crystal flute, took a slow, elegant sip of her vintage champagne, and deliberately turned her head away as the entire room erupted into mocking, heartless laughter. The heavy brass doors of the Waldorf Astoria slammed shut behind me with a final echoing thud. The security guards had literally thrown me onto the freezing concrete of the Manhattan sidewalk. I stumbled forward, my knees scraping against the rough pavement and tearing the expensive fabric of my black designer dress. The crisp November wind immediately bit into my bare skin, a harsh contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom I had just been exiled from. Pedestrians in heavy winter coats paused to stare at the disheveled woman in evening wear, sprawled outside the city's most famous hotel. I did not cry. I did not scream. I slowly stood up, brushed the grit from my hands, and straightened my ruined dress with absolute precision. My pulse was incredibly steady. For the first time in 10 years, I felt a profound and crystal clear sense of liberation. They thought they had just disposed of the family garbage. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire house down. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. As the screen illuminated my face in the dark, let me explain something my father desperately tried to hide from the business world. 3 years ago, Richard made a series of catastrophically stupid investments in overseas commercial real estate. He leveraged our logistics empire to the absolute brink, gambling with our operational capital to feed his own massive ego. The banks were preparing to seize everything we had. He was weeks away from total bankruptcy, facing the complete loss of his reputation and potentially severe criminal charges for mishandling client funds. He begged me to fix it. He told me I was the only one smart enough to navigate the legal maze and save the family name. So I did. But I did not use the company US money to do it. I used my own. For years, I had quietly invested my executive bonuses and strategic market trades into a highly successful shell company. It was a private asset management firm I created and named Vanguard Holdings. Richard thought Vanguard was just a faceless private equity group operating out of Chicago. He had absolutely no idea I was the sole owner and primary architect of the fund. When the creditors came knocking at his door, Vanguard Holdings quietly purchased every single cent of his toxic corporate debt. I bailed him out. I saved the company and kept his ridiculous billionaire persona intact. But I am not a fool, and I knew my family better than anyone else in the world. I knew my father would eventually try to take the credit for the recovery and discard me the moment he felt his throne was safe. So when Vanguard bought the debt, my lawyers embedded an ironclad default clause deep within the hundreds of pages of complex financial restructuring documents. Article 4 of the Master Agreement stated unequivocally that if my operational authority was ever revoked, or if I was forcefully removed from the executive suite without my explicit written consent, the entire debt would become payable immediately. All $85 million of it. My fingers flew across the glass screen of my phone. I opened a secure encrypted messaging thread with my lead corporate attorney who was standing by in his downtown office just 3 blocks away. I did not type out a long emotional explanation. I did not ask for legal advice. I simply typed one sentence. Execute Article 4 of the Vanguard Holding Agreement. Burn it down. I hit send and watched the little bubble turn blue. A second later, the reply popped up on my screen. Executing now. I did not call a taxi to go home. I did not walk away to lick my wounds in private. I simply stood on the sidewalk, crossed my arms against the freezing wind, and stared up at the massive glowing windows of the ballroom on the second floor. I knew exactly what was about to happen. It takes modern corporate banking software approximately 3 minutes to freeze an enterprise account and lock out unauthorized users. I started counting the seconds in my head. Exactly 180 seconds later, the warm golden light spilling from the ballroom windows suddenly flickered and died. A chaotic murmur bled through the thick architectural glass. Inside, Richard was likely mid-sentence bragging about his generational wealth when his microphone went completely dead. The house lights shut off. The massive digital banners behind the stage, which had been proudly flashing his name in bold gold letters, abruptly blacked out. The emergency backup generators kicked in, a moment later booting up the digital screens. Not with my father U.S. congratulatory retirement montage, but with a stark and blindingly white corporate logo. Vanguard Holdings. And right below it, in massive black letters, it read, Chief Executive Officer Allison. Down on the street, I saw a familiar figure practically sprinting through the revolving glass doors of the lobby. It was Jamal. He was frantically tapping at his corporate phone, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. I knew exactly what he was seeing. A bright red security warning. Access denied. Server credentials revoked. His executive accounts, his company credit cards, his email, absolutely everything was frozen. He looked up, spotted me standing calmly by the curb, and his jaw dropped in absolute horror. He realized the gravity of the situation before anyone else did. Before Jamal could find the words to speak, the heavy brass doors violently burst open again. Richard stormed out into the cold night. His face was purple with pure rage, a stark contrast to his pristine custom tuxedo. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He marched straight toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, completely abandoning his refined society persona. He screamed at me, demanding to know what kind of cyber attack I had just launched against his network. He threatened to call the police and the federal authorities, loudly accusing me of hacking the corporate mainframe out of bitter jealousy over my sister. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse, and a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk to watch the wealthy CEO lose his mind. Then I took a step closer, looking him dead in the eye. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm and steady. I told him there was no cyber attack. I told him he should have paid much more attention to the people saving his life 3 years ago instead of worrying about his golf handicap. I watched the color completely drain from his face as I revealed the truth. I explained that Vanguard Holdings was not a faceless group of investors from the Midwest. Vanguard Holdings was me. I owned his massive debt. I owned the strict default clause he had just foolishly triggered by publicly humiliating and firing me. And as of 3 minutes ago, I legally owned the intellectual property, the operational bank accounts, the downtown corporate headquarters, and every single logistics contract in his portfolio. His name was entirely erased from the registry. I smiled warmly and told him to enjoy his retirement because he was now officially completely broke and unemployed. His rage evaporated instantly, replaced by a pathetic, desperate panic as he reached out his hands and started begging me to come back inside and fix what he had done. I took a slow step backward, ensuring his manicured hands caught nothing but the freezing New York air. I looked down at him, my expression completely hollow of any sympathy. I told him there was absolutely nothing broken to fix. The system was operating exactly as it was legally designed to. I turned my back on my father, hailed a passing black car, and left him standing on the sidewalk in his expensive tuxedo, surrounded by the confused murmurs of the city. As the car pulled away, I did not look back at the Waldorf Astoria. I spent the rest of the weekend entirely off the grid, sitting in my lawyer's office, legally transferring every corporate asset, changing server firewalls, and preparing for the absolute bloodbath that I knew Monday morning would bring. Monday arrived with a sharp, blinding sunrise. By 7 in the morning, I was already standing in the massive glass lobby of our downtown corporate headquarters. The building was a towering monument to my father's ego, built with imported Italian marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. But this morning, the atmosphere was entirely different. I had brought in a private security firm over the weekend, terminating my father's loyal guards with generous severance packages and replacing them with highly trained personnel who answered exclusively to Vanguard Holdings. I stood quietly by the main security desk, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, sipping a black coffee, and watching the grand entrance. At exactly 8:45, the heavy revolving doors spun violently. Richard stormed into the lobby, his face flushed with the same purple rage from the gala. Right behind him was Natalie, clutching a designer handbag like a shield, wearing oversized sunglasses to hide what I assumed were stress-induced eye bags. Jamal flanked them on the right, his jaw set in a hard, arrogant line. They marched confidently toward the primary security turnstiles, clearly expecting to march up to the executive suite, call the police, and have me dragged out of the building in handcuffs for corporate sabotage. Richard did not even look at the new security guards. He forcefully slapped his gold-level executive keycard against the glass scanner. A loud, harsh buzz echoed through the marble lobby. The scanner flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. Richard scoffed loudly, muttering something about incompetent IT departments. He slapped the card against the scanner a second time. The machine buzzed aggressively again. The glass gates remained locked tight. Natalie stepped forward, huffing in annoyance, and tapped her own silver keycard. Red light, angry buzz. Jamal frowned, pulling out his phone to open the digital access app, but his screen was completely blank. "Sir, step away from the turnstiles." The voice belonged to my new head of security, a towering man in a crisp, dark suit. He stepped squarely in front of my father, his posture rigid and uncompromising. Richard stared at the man as if he had just grown a second head. He puffed out his chest, his voice echoing loudly across the lobby as early morning employees began to trickle in and stop in their tracks to watch the spectacle. He screamed that he was the chief executive officer of the company, that his name was on the lease, and that he demanded the gates be opened immediately before he fired every single person standing in the room. That is when I stepped out from behind the marble security column. I walked slowly toward the glass barricade, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I looked directly at my father and informed him that his name was actually no longer on the lease. I told him that as of Saturday morning, Vanguard Holdings was the sole proprietor of the building. I slid a thick envelope across the polished counter of the security desk. Inside was a formal, legally binding trespass warning. I advised him to take the document, turn around, and walk out the front doors before I had him arrested for creating a public disturbance on my private property. Natalie pulled off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She looked from me to our father, her voice trembling as she asked him what I was talking about. She demanded to know why her keycard was not working and why her corporate credit cards had been declined at the coffee shop that morning. Richard could not even look at her. His arrogant posture was crumbling piece by piece under the weight of the reality he was finally being forced to face. But Jamal was not ready to surrender. He stepped right up to the glass turnstile, leaning his tall athletic frame over the barrier to glare down at me. His charismatic salesman persona was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He lowered his voice so the gathering crowd of employees could not hear him, but I heard every venomous word perfectly clear. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game. He whispered that I had always been the jealous, ugly duckling of the family, bitter because Natalie was beautiful and loved while I was just a sad, lonely workaholic. He promised me that he had enough high-level industry contacts to completely destroy my professional reputation before noon. He said he would make sure no vendor, no supplier, and no client would ever sign a contract with Vanguard Holdings as long as I was sitting in the CEO chair. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I reached into the deep pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it up between my index finger and thumb, letting the lobby lights catch its metallic surface. I looked Jamal dead in the eye and asked him if he really wanted to call his industry contacts. I asked him if he wanted me to send them the contents of this drive first. I watched his eyes track the small device, his confident sneer faltering just a fraction of an inch. I leaned slightly closer to the glass and spoke with absolute icy clarity. I told him I had known for 2 full years that he was systematically embezzling operational funds from the logistics department to finance Natalie's lavish lifestyle. I recited the exact routing numbers of the offshore accounts he used to hide the stolen cash. I listed the exact dates of the fake vendor invoices he had approved last quarter. I told him I had watched him steal hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I chose to stay completely silent, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to let him dig his own grave. The color drained from Jamal's face so fast he looked physically ill. He took a slow, staggering step back from the glass turnstile. Natalie whipped her head around to look at her husband. Her voice was shrill and confused as she demanded to know what I was talking about. She grabbed Jamal's arm, asking him to tell her I was lying about the stolen money. Jamal did not say a single word. He just stared at the silver flash drive in my hand like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. He knew it was over. He knew I had every single receipt, and he knew embezzlement carried a heavy federal prison sentence. My father, however, was still desperately clinging to his delusion of power. His phone rang loudly in his jacket pocket. He snatched it out, saw the caller ID, and let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. He answered the call and put it on speakerphone, holding it up like a trophy. It was his high-powered corporate attorney. The lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker, smug and dripping with expensive arrogance. He told Richard not to worry about my little stunt. He declared that my hostile debt buyout was a massive conflict of interest and blatantly illegal. The lawyer promised Richard that he was already drafting the paperwork to force an emergency session of the board of directors. He guaranteed they would vote me out and strip me of my Vanguard assets before lunch. Richard smiled for the first time all morning. He looked through the glass at me, his confidence returning in a sickening wave. He told me the board would crush me, that I was nothing but a rogue employee who had overstepped her bounds. I smiled back. It was a genuine warm smile that made my father's triumphant expression instantly falter. I pressed the button on the wall to call the private executive elevator. The glass doors slid open behind me. I stepped inside, turned around to face my panicked family standing on the wrong side of the security gates, and looked directly at my father. I told him to go ahead and call the board. I told him to summon every single director to the top floor by noon. Let us see who they actually answer to. The glass doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of my father shouting my name, and the elevator shot up toward the penthouse. The elevator doors opened smoothly on the penthouse level, revealing the hushed, expansive quiet of the executive floor. I walked straight past my father's old corner office and headed directly into the massive glass-walled boardroom. I took my seat at the very head of the long mahogany table. For 10 years, my designated spot had been a small chair off to the side, where I was expected to quietly take notes and fix the financial errors my father made during his meetings. But today, the head chair was mine. I opened my laptop, reviewed the corporate bylaws one final time, and waited for noon to arrive. By 12 o'clock sharp, the boardroom was packed with tension you could cut with a knife. Richard had spent the entire morning frantically calling every single member of the board of directors, demanding they rush downtown for an emergency session. He marched into the room looking like a general preparing for war, followed closely by Jamal and Natalie. Surprisingly, my mother, Patricia, was trailing right behind them. Patricia had absolutely no official role in the company, nor did she understand a single thing about logistics or corporate finance. But she lived for the drama of high society politics, and she clearly believed her presence would intimidate me into submission. Patricia took a seat next to Richard, adjusting her expensive silk scarf. She looked down the long table at me with a heavy, disappointed sigh, perfectly playing the role of the long-suffering mother. She leaned forward and told me in a soft, condescending tone to stop throwing a childish tantrum. She said that family always comes first and that I was embarrassing myself and ruining my father's legacy by playing these vicious corporate games. She asked me to step down gracefully so we could all go home and put this ugly misunderstanding behind us. I closed my laptop and looked right into my mother's eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the entire board of directors heard every word. I asked Patricia if family came first when I was 20 years old, sitting alone in a freezing college dorm over Thanksgiving break, because she refused to let me come home. I reminded her of the exact excuse she had used. She had told me there was simply no room for me in our massive 10-bedroom estate because Natalie needed the entire East Wing to host a weekend photo shoot for her completely non-existent modeling career. I told Patricia that I vividly remembered eating dining hall turkey from a plastic tray while she and my father toasted to Natalie's future. I leaned forward and told my mother that the expiration date for her fake maternal advice had passed 15 years ago. Patricia's jaw snapped shut, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. Before anyone else could speak, I reached under the lip of the mahogany table and pressed the security lockdown button. The heavy double doors of the boardroom clicked shut, and the magnetic locks engaged with a loud, final thud. I announced to the room that nobody was leaving until the reality of our new corporate structure was permanently settled. Richard stood up abruptly, smoothing his custom silk tie. He addressed the older men and women sitting around the table, projecting his voice with the practiced authority of a man who was used to blind obedience. He formally demanded an immediate vote of no confidence to strip me of my title, invalidate Vanguard Holdings, and restore his absolute control over the company. He spoke passionately about his legacy, about how he had built this logistics empire from the ground up, and painted me as an unstable, jealous rogue element, trying to steal what was never mine to take. He called for a show of hands to remove me from the building. Richard confidently raised his own hand high in the air, a smug smile spreading across his face. Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with a satisfied smirk, while Natalie glared at me with absolute triumph. But as the heavy seconds ticked by, the boardroom remained entirely still. Not a single director raised their hand. Richard's confident smile slowly fractured. He looked to his left, then to his right, staring at the wealthy investors and business partners he had golfed with for decades. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know what was wrong with them, shouting that they were letting a hysterical woman ruin their investments. I steepled my fingers on the desk and allowed myself a small, cold smile. I calmly explained to my father that while he was busy expanding his vintage car collection and taking month-long vacations to Europe, I had been incredibly busy working behind his back. I told him that over the last 5 years, I had used the massive profits from my own strategic side investments to quietly approach the company's silent partners one by one. I offered them premium buyouts when his erratic leadership made them nervous about the future of their money. I watched the absolute horror dawn on my father's face as I delivered the final blow. I told him I did not just own his corporate debt. I held a solid 60% majority of the voting shares. The board of directors did not raise their hands because they no longer worked for him. They answered exclusively to me. Natalie broke the silence by slamming her hands flat against the wood. She burst into dramatic theatrical tears, screaming across the room that the company was her birthright. She sobbed that our father had promised the CEO title to her and Jamal, and that I was nothing but a manipulative thief stealing her future. I completely ignored her outburst, keeping my eyes locked dead on my father. Richard slowly lowered his hand. The desperate panic in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a dark, calculating malice I had never actually seen from him before. He let out a low, bitter laugh that echoed harshly in the sealed room. He reached into his suit jacket and tossed a thin manila folder across the polished wood table. It slid to a stop right in front of me. He looked at me with pure venom and told me that I might own the building and I might own the voting shares, but I had just inherited a beautiful multi-million-dollar corpse. He revealed that late Saturday night, the moment he realized Vanguard Holdings was moving in to seize his assets, he had used his emergency executive overrides to access the main corporate operational accounts before my bank freeze fully processed. He had systematically drained every single dollar of our liquid cash, transferring the funds into untraceable offshore trusts under a hidden shell corporation he controlled. Richard leaned heavily on the table, a terrifyingly genuine smile returning to his face. He promised me that without that liquid capital, I would not be able to make the massive employee payroll by Friday morning. He swore that the logistics empire I had fought so hard to take over would entirely collapse in a matter of days, and I would be left holding nothing but the ashes of a bankrupt company. Beside him, Jamal let out a deep, satisfied chuckle, absolutely certain that they had just checkmated me. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos the very second Richard dropped the bombshell about the drained operational accounts. The older directors who had just silently backed my takeover were suddenly shouting over each other, their faces pale with the terrifying realization that their massive investments were now tied to a corporation with zero operating capital. Richard did not stay to answer their panicked questions. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit jacket, gave me a final mocking salute, and walked out of the glass doors with Natalie and Jamal right on his heels. Jamal was laughing loudly, clearly, believing that his own dark embezzlement secrets were entirely safe now that the Vanguard Empire was going down in flames. By Tuesday morning, they launched a coordinated, vicious assault on my personal and professional reputation. Natalie and Jamal went straight to the business press. They sat for exclusive interviews with major financial news networks, painting a highly fabricated picture of me as a mentally unstable, greedy spinster who had manipulated complex corporate loopholes to steal her father's hard-earned legacy. Natalie cried perfectly timed tears on national television, wearing a modest conservative dress she had specifically bought to play the victim. Jamal used his natural, aggressive sales charisma to spin a narrative that I was a rogue, bitter accountant who had completely lost her mind. The public smear campaign worked immediately. The stock for Vanguard Holdings took a sharp, terrifying hit right at the opening bell. But the media war was only a smokescreen for their real strategy. Jamal's true attack was happening quietly behind the scenes. He leveraged his years of building close relationships on expensive golf courses to aggressively poach our top 3 logistics clients. He called them directly, spreading rumors that Vanguard was completely insolvent and would absolutely not be able to fulfill their international shipping contracts by the end of the week. By Wednesday afternoon, I received 3 massive cancellation notices from our biggest accounts. My newly appointed executive team was in an absolute panic. The board of directors called my private office every single hour, practically begging me to surrender, step down, and negotiate a truce with my father before the entire shipping empire collapsed completely. They desperately wanted me to break. They wanted me to call Richard, admit complete defeat, and hand him back the keys to the kingdom in exchange for the offshore funds. But I absolutely refuse to negotiate with financial terrorists, especially when they share my last name. What Richard had completely forgotten in his arrogant, desperate rush to drain the operational accounts was the foundational legal paperwork of the debt I had bought 3 years ago. When he was on the verge of total bankruptcy, back then he was so desperate for a cash infusion that he had personally guaranteed the massive corporate loans. He had used the sprawling family estate in Connecticut and his entire collection of vintage European sports cars as direct collateral. And because Vanguard Holdings now owned that exact debt, Vanguard Holdings legally owned the collateral. I did not call my father to argue or plead for my money. I called my aggressive legal team. I instructed them to file an immediate emergency injunction with the federal court. I provided the presiding judge with the exact routing numbers Richard had used to illegally funnel the company payroll to his offshore trusts, proving with hard data that he was deliberately sabotaging a major American corporation and putting thousands of employee livelihoods at immediate risk. The federal judge did not hesitate for a single second. Within hours, the court granted my request for a total asset freeze and authorized the immediate seizure of all personal property tied to the Vanguard loans to cover the stolen operational funds. Thursday afternoon arrived with bright, crisp autumn skies. 30 miles away, in an exclusive Connecticut suburb, my mother, Patricia, was hosting her highly anticipated high society luncheon at the family estate. I knew her social schedule perfectly because Natalie had previously used company money to cater the event. Patricia was entertaining dozens of wealthy wives, country club presidents, and local politicians, undoubtedly spending the entire afternoon complaining over expensive wine about how ungrateful and vicious I was to the family. I drove out of the city and parked my sleek black sedan across the street from the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. I rolled down my tinted window and watched the long, sweeping driveway. Precisely at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a heavy convoy of dark government vehicles pulled up to the property. Federal marshals dressed in dark tactical gear stepped out, holding heavy stacks of court orders on brightly colored paper. They bypassed the private security intercom, entirely marching straight up the manicured front lawn and pushing open the grand double doors of the house. I sat quietly in my car and watched the absolute chaos unfold. Wealthy women in designer dresses began pouring out of the front doors, rushing to their luxury cars in sheer panic as the marshals began tagging expensive artwork, imported furniture, and crystal chandeliers with bright orange seizure stickers. 2 massive flatbed tow trucks rolled up the driveway, their hydraulic lifts whining loudly as they began loading Richard's prized vintage cars right out of the climate-controlled garage. My phone buzzed loudly in the passenger seat. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 full times before I calmly pressed the answer button. Patricia was completely hysterical. Her refined, elitist country club accent was entirely gone, replaced by a shrill, breathless panic that pierced through the speaker. She screamed into the phone, demanding to know what was happening to her house. She said armed men were walking through her pristine kitchen and actively kicking her most important guests out of the formal dining room. She begged me to call them off, sobbing that I was humiliating her in front of the entire neighborhood and destroying her social standing forever. I listened to her cry. I listened to the sound of the superficial life she valued far more than her own daughter being dismantled piece by piece. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. I told her that Richard had stolen the money needed to pay the thousands of people who actually worked for a living, so I was simply collecting the debt he rightfully owed Vanguard. I coldly reminded her of her own words from the boardroom, telling her that family comes first, and right now she needed to fully support her husband's terrible financial decisions. Patricia wailed into the receiver, begging me for mercy, asking where they were supposed to sleep that night if the state seized the house. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. I told her the sun sets at exactly 6:15 this evening. I advised her to pack her most comfortable walking shoes and ensure she was entirely off my property before it gets dark. Then I hung up the phone. The family was officially homeless. The sun set on Thursday evening, permanently closing the chapter on my family's reign over Connecticut high society. By Friday morning, the reality of their absolute ruin had finally settled in. They had spent the night in a moderately priced airport hotel, stripped of their luxury cars, their sprawling estate, and their endless supply of corporate credit. At exactly 9 o'clock, my private line rang. It was not Richard calling to scream at me. It was a senior partner from one of the most ruthless, top-tier corporate mediation firms in Manhattan. He formally requested an immediate sit-down. Richard was finally ready to wave a white flag, or at least he thought he was. I arrived at the law firm at noon dressed in a sharp navy blue suit carrying nothing but a single slim leather briefcase. The mediation room was a massive glass box overlooking the city's skyline, designed to make people feel small and insignificant. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, the sight before me was almost pitiful. Richard sat at the far end of the long conference table. In just 5 days, he had aged 10 years. His posture was slumped, and the arrogant billionaire aura he usually wore like a second skin was completely gone. Patricia sat next to him, wearing dark sunglasses indoors to hide her swollen, tear-stained eyes. Natalie was staring blankly at the polished wood table, completely stripped of her designer jewelry and her usual confident sneer. Jamal sat a few chairs away from them, his leg bouncing rapidly under the table in a nervous, uncontrollable rhythm. Richard's attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to intimidate people, cleared his throat and slid a thick legal binder across the table toward me. He steepled his fingers and adopted a patronizing, compromising tone. He explained that my father was willing to offer me a generous truce to save the family from further public embarrassment. Richard leaned forward, trying to summon a fraction of his old authoritative voice. He told me that if I signed the contract his lawyer had prepared, he would immediately wire the stolen operational funds back into Vanguard Holdings from his offshore accounts. In exchange, I would surrender 51% of the voting shares back to him, guaranteeing his control over the company, and I would officially reinstate Natalie as the co-chief executive officer. If I refused, Richard threatened to drag Vanguard Holdings into a brutal decade-long legal war. He promised to file endless appeals, injunctions, and lawsuits that would drain every single cent of my personal wealth and paralyze the company until we were both bankrupt. He glared at me across the table, trying to look dangerous, demanding that I take the deal and end this foolish rebellion. I did not touch the binder. I did not consult with the legal counsel sitting quietly beside me. I simply placed my slim leather briefcase on the glass table and snapped the two brass locks open. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I looked at my father and told him that he was severely misunderstanding the current dynamic. I told him this was not a negotiation, and we were absolutely not here to discuss a truce. We were here to discuss the terms of his total unconditional surrender. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of original unredacted financial ledgers. These were not the sanitized copies Richard had provided to the corporate board of directors. These were the raw, highly illegal documents I had discovered 3 years ago when I first started untangling his massive debts. I slid the documents across the glass table. I watched Richard's attorney open the folder and begin to read. Within 10 seconds, all the arrogant color completely drained from the lawyer's face. I kept my voice crystal clear, projecting it so that every single person in the room understood the exact gravity of the situation. I stated that the documents proved Richard did not just make bad investments that nearly bankrupted the company. He had actively committed massive, deliberate federal tax evasion. He had systematically forged United States customs documents to bypass heavy international shipping tariffs, using fake shell companies to launder the extra revenue. I told the room that these were severe federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences of 20 years. Richard lunged forward, his hands trembling as he grabbed the papers. He stared at his own forged signatures, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. Patricia let out a horrified, muffled gasp, burying her face in her hands. The high-powered attorney immediately closed his notebook, leaned away from Richard, and stated clearly that he could not represent a client actively engaged in criminal fraud. The room descended into a suffocating, heavy silence. That is when Jamal broke. Jamal had been sitting quietly, his eyes darting between the tax documents and my father's terrified face. The moment he realized the ship was not just sinking, but plunging straight to the bottom of the ocean, his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs screeching loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard. Jamal's voice cracked with absolute panic as he loudly declared that he had nothing to do with the customs fraud or the tax evasion. He turned to me, completely abandoning his wife and his father-in-law. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, his charismatic mask entirely shattered. He begged me to listen to him. He offered to become a star witness for the federal prosecution. He promised to testify against Richard in open court, surrender any corporate documents I needed, and walk away from Natalie forever as long as I let him keep his executive severance package, and promised not to press charges against him for his own embezzlement. Natalie screamed his name, absolutely devastated by the immediate and vicious betrayal from her own husband. I looked at Jamal with a cold, unblinking stare. I slowly shook my head. I told Jamal that I did not need his testimony because my father was not going to let this go to trial. And as for his generous offer to walk away cleanly, I informed him that he was approximately 48 hours too late. I calmly explained that while my legal team was busy freezing the family estate on Thursday, I had personally couriered the silver flash drive containing all the proof of his offshore embezzlement directly to the district attorney's office. Jamal froze, his eyes widening in pure terror. He stammered, demanding to know what I had done. Right on cue, the faint wailing sound of police sirens drifted up from the busy Manhattan streets below, growing louder and more urgent by the second. I looked at my gold wristwatch, then looked back at my brother-in-law. I suggested that he might want to take the elevator down to the lobby, because the authorities generally do not like to be kept waiting. Jamal turned completely white. He practically stumbled backward over his chair, turning around and sprinting out of the glass mediation room in a blind panic. We all watched in absolute silence as he bolted down the hallway. 2 minutes later, my phone chimed with a text message from my security team downstairs. Jamal had been intercepted in the lobby, handcuffed in front of the reception desk, and escorted out of the building by 4 uniformed officers. I turned my attention back to the table. Natalie was weeping openly, her head buried in her arms, her perfect life completely dismantled. Patricia was staring out the window, completely catatonic. And Richard, the great billionaire, the man who had publicly humiliated me and called me a useless paper pusher, was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own crimes. I slid a single legally binding contract across the table toward him. I told him the terms were incredibly simple. He would immediately return the stolen operational funds. He would sign away all remaining equity voting rights and any future claim to Vanguard Holdings. He would sign a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement preventing him from ever speaking to the press again. If he signed it right now, I would lock the tax fraud documents in my personal vault and let him walk away to live a quiet, impoverished life. If he refused, I would hand the folder to the FBI before dinner. Richard picked up the heavy gold pen sitting on the table. His hands shook so violently he could barely grip it. He did not argue. He did not threaten me. He simply signed his name on the dotted line, officially surrendering his empire, his legacy, and his entire life to the daughter he had spent 35 years trying to destroy. The glass elevator chimed softly as it reached the penthouse floor. I stepped out into the expansive, hushed hallway of the executive suite. The thick wool carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, but my presence was immediately felt the moment I turned the corner. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the main boardroom, I could see the chaos I had orchestrated. The entire board of directors had been hastily assembled, pulled from their golf games and luxury weekend homes. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked inside. The low, panicked murmur of conversations instantly died, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. At the far end of the incredibly long conference table stood my father, Richard. He had forcefully taken his usual spot at the head of the table, standing tall and projecting a deeply fabricated aura of total control. He was flanked by Natalie, who was furiously typing on her phone, and Jamal, who was pacing back and forth with a dark, aggressive scowl on his face. But what caught my attention was the woman sitting quietly in a plush leather chair in the far corner of the room. It was my mother, Patricia. Patricia had absolutely no official role at Vanguard Holdings. She did not know the difference between a gross profit margin and a net loss. She had never stepped foot on a logistics shipping yard or negotiated a single corporate contract in her entire life. But she was there to play her absolute favorite role, the long-suffering, elegant matriarch, trying to keep her unruly, ungrateful daughter in line. She wore a pristine white designer suit, her hair perfectly styled, a heavy string of pearls resting elegantly against her collarbone. She was the ultimate enabler, the woman who had spent 35 years actively shielding Richard and Natalie from the consequences of their own terrible decisions. As I walked slowly toward the opposite end of the table, placing my slim leather briefcase on the polished wood, Patricia stood up. She did not shout. She did not use anger. Instead, she deployed the soft, condescending, weaponized tone she had perfected over decades of managing country club politics. She took a step forward, clasping her manicured hands together, and looked at me with an expression of deep, exaggerated pity. She told me to sit down and stop throwing a childish tantrum. Her voice echoed clearly across the silent boardroom. She said I was embarrassing the family legacy in front of our most respected colleagues and investors. She smiled a tight, entirely fake smile and reminded me that blood is thicker than water. She said that family always comes first, and that I was tearing our beautiful lives apart over a petty, jealous misunderstanding. She asked me to apologize to my father so we could all go home and sweep this ugly corporate mess under the rug. I stopped walking. I did not sit down. I slowly turned to face my mother, feeling the heavy, expectant eyes of every single board member locked directly onto me. I let her words hang in the freezing air for a few moments, allowing the sheer hypocrisy of her statement to fully marinate in the room. I kept my voice terrifyingly level. I did not raise my pitch or show a single ounce of emotional distress. I looked Patricia dead in the eyes and asked her if family came first during my sophomore year of college. Patricia blinked, her perfect, condescending smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. She clearly had no idea what I was talking about. I took a slow step toward her, ensuring my voice projected to the farthest corners of the executive suite. I asked her if she remembered the Thanksgiving holiday when I was 19 years old. I painted the picture for the silent room of wealthy directors. I explained that the university campus had completely shut down for the week. The heating systems in the older dormitories were turned off to save money, and the campus dining halls were entirely padlocked. A massive winter storm was moving into the northeast, dropping temperatures well below freezing. I had called home asking for a simple train ticket back to our sprawling Connecticut estate so I could spend the holiday with my family. I looked directly at Natalie, who suddenly stopped typing on her phone and looked down at her lap. I turned back to my mother and told the boardroom exactly what Patricia had said to me on that phone call 15 years ago. I reminded her that she had told me there was simply no room for me at our massive 10-bedroom house. She had explicitly forbidden me from coming home because Natalie needed the entire east wing of the estate, including my childhood bedroom, to host a weekend photo shoot with a professional crew to build her amateur modeling portfolio. I watched the color begin to drain from Patricia's face as I aired our darkest family secrets in front of the most powerful investors in the city. I described how I spent that Thanksgiving entirely alone, wrapped in 3 thin blankets in a freezing, empty dormitory. I told them how I ate stale vending machine crackers for my holiday dinner while my mother and father toasted champagne to Natalie's non-existent modeling career. I explained that I had spent the entire weekend shivering in the dark, wondering what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own mother would leave me to freeze just to satisfy my sister's boundless vanity. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She looked frantically around the room, realizing that the board members were staring at her with profound disgust. Her elegant country club facade was cracking violently under the bright fluorescent lights. I did not give her a chance to recover. I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us. I told my mother that the expiration date for her maternal manipulation had passed a very long time ago. I stated clearly that she had permanently lost the right to invoke the word family the day she chose a photo shoot over my basic survival. I told her that she was not a mother to me. She was just an accessory to my father's arrogance, and her fake guilt trips held absolutely no power here. Patricia collapsed back into her leather chair. Her face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. She pulled her designer handbag into her lap and stared out the window, completely silenced. Jamal gritted his teeth, shifting his weight nervously while Richard slammed his heavy hand flat against the mahogany table. Richard demanded order. He shouted that we were not here to discuss ancient family history or college grievances. He loudly declared that we were here to vote on the immediate removal of a rogue, highly unstable employee who was actively attempting to sabotage the greatest logistics company in the country. He pointed a shaking finger at me and ordered me to take my seat so the board could officially strip me of my Vanguard Holdings authority. I did not take my seat. Instead, I calmly walked over to the main security panel located on the wall directly next to the heavy double doors. I looked at the digital interface, then looked all the way down the long table to meet my father's furious gaze. I reached out and pressed the glowing red security lockdown button. A loud, piercing beep echoed through the penthouse suite. Immediately following the alarm, the heavy magnetic deadbolts inside the boardroom doors slammed into place with a violent, echoing thud. The manual handles completely locked. The room was now completely sealed from the outside world. Several of the older board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing back at the locked doors in sudden panic. Richard's arrogant posture stiffened. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I walked back to my spot at the opposite end of the table, carefully unbuttoning my suit jacket, and took my seat. I folded my hands neatly on the polished wood. I looked at Richard, then at the terrified board of directors, and announced that no one was leaving this room until the reality of our new corporate structure was permanently settled. The vote was going to happen right now, and they were all going to watch my father lose his empire in real time. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit, refusing to let my lockdown tactic break his carefully constructed facade of authority. He turned away from me entirely and walked slowly down the length of the long mahogany table, placing his hands firmly on the back of his leather executive chair. He looked at the dozen older men and women sitting around the room. These were his golfing partners, his country club associates, the wealthy investors he had spent decades charming over expensive scotch and imported cigars. He was absolutely certain they belonged to him. He cleared his throat and adopted the deep, commanding tone he used at shareholder meetings. He told the board that we had all entertained this ridiculous theatrical display long enough. He pointed a finger at me, his voice dripping with condescension. He stated that I was clearly suffering from a severe emotional breakdown, entirely unable to separate my personal family grievances from the objective reality of running a multi-billion-dollar global logistics empire. He painted a masterful picture of himself as the stable, visionary patriarch who was simply trying to protect their massive financial investments from an unstable, rogue employee who had managed to exploit a temporary legal loophole. Richard slammed his palm flat against the table for dramatic effect. He formally demanded an immediate emergency vote. He called for a motion of absolute no confidence against me. He demanded that the board vote to instantly invalidate Vanguard Holdings' hostile restructuring, strip me of my temporary executive powers, and permanently restore his rightful control over the company. He added that upon his reinstatement, Natalie and Jamal would immediately assume their roles as co-chief executive officers, just as he had promised at the gala. He stood tall, puffing out his chest with absolute certainty. He called for all those in favor of the motion to raise their right hands. Richard immediately shot his own hand high into the air. Beside him, Natalie eagerly raised both of her hands, her face glowing with triumphant, spiteful joy. Jamal stood against the back wall, crossing his arms and nodding vigorously, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Then they waited for the board to follow suit. 10 seconds passed in total suffocating silence. The heavy ticking of the designer wall clock suddenly sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Not a single board member moved. Nobody raised their hand. Nobody murmured in agreement. Several of the older directors actually shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs and deliberately averted their eyes, staring down at their polished dress shoes or examining the blank screens of their phones. The complete lack of support was deafening. Richard's triumphant smile froze. The blood slowly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray under the bright fluorescent lights. His arm, still raised high in the air, began to tremble slightly. He lowered it slowly, his eyes darting frantically around the table. He looked at a white-haired man sitting near the middle. He called out to him, his voice suddenly lacking its booming authority. He told William that they had known each other for 30 years. He looked at another director across the table, reminding Harrison that they had built the European supply chain together from scratch. He demanded to know what they were doing. He shouted that they were letting a hysterical woman completely ruin their retirement portfolios. William let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look at my father. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the wood grain of the table. He spoke in a quiet, incredibly defeated voice. He told Richard that it was over. He said they simply did not have the voting power to help him anymore. Richard practically lunged across the table, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He demanded to know what William meant. He screamed that he was the founder, the face of the brand, and the majority shareholder. That is when I stood up from my chair at the head of the table. I kept my voice smooth, cold, and razor-sharp. I told my father that he had not been the majority shareholder for over 3 years. I told him he had simply been too lazy and too distracted by his own reflection to notice that his kingdom was being systematically dismantled right out from under him. I picked up a sleek black remote from the table and pressed a button. The massive digital screen behind me instantly illuminated, displaying a highly detailed, incredibly complex pie chart representing the total equity distribution of the logistics empire. I walked toward the screen, letting the blue light wash over me, and began to explain my next secret weapon. I looked directly at my father and broke down the timeline. I told him that while he was spending entire months playing golf on exclusive private courses in Scotland, I was working 100-hour weeks. While he was buying multi-million-dollar vintage cars and taking my mother on luxury European cruises to keep up appearances, I was quietly having private, highly confidential dinners with every single silent partner in this room. I explained that these investors were not stupid. They knew Richard was recklessly bleeding the company dry to fund his extravagant lifestyle. They were terrified of losing their generational wealth because of his sheer incompetence. So I offered them a way out. I told the room that I had taken the massive compounded profits I had earned from my own private stock market investments over the last 5 years, and I used that money to aggressively approach each board member one by one. I offered to buy out their Class A voting shares at a highly premium above market rate. I pointed to the digital screen behind me. I read the numbers aloud, ensuring every single syllable hit my father like a physical blow. I told him that he currently held exactly 20% of the company equity. Natalie held a 10% vanity trust fund that had zero voting power. The remaining 10% was scattered among minor executives. But Vanguard Holdings, my private firm, held a massive, completely ironclad 60% majority. I looked at Richard, whose jaw was completely slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. I told him that I did not just own his corporate debt. I owned the board. I owned the votes. I owned the absolute right to terminate his employment without a single ounce of severance, and there was absolutely nothing he or his high-priced lawyers could do to stop me. The reality of the situation crashed down on the room like a concrete block. The silence was broken by a sudden, piercing shriek. Natalie slammed both of her hands flat against the mahogany table. She violently pushed her chair back, causing it to tip over and crash loudly against the floor. her perfect manicured facade completely shattered. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and screamed at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that the company was her birthright. She sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing off the glass walls, screaming that our father had explicitly promised the CEO title to her. She called me a disgusting, jealous thief. She wailed that I had spent my entire life being bitter because she was the beautiful, beloved daughter, while I was just the ugly, miserable workhorse in the background. She demanded that I give her back her company immediately. I watched my 30-year-old sister throw a literal temper tantrum in the middle of a corporate boardroom. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply let her scream until she was breathless and gasping for air. When she finally stopped chest heaving and makeup running down her face, I looked at her with absolute freezing contempt. I told Natalie that a birthright is an imaginary concept invented by weak people who lack the intelligence and the work ethic to actually build something for themselves. I reminded her that the only thing she had ever successfully managed in her entire life was my father's credit card limit. I told her that she did not lose her company today because she never actually had one to begin with. She was nothing but a figurehead waiting to inherit an empire she could not even comprehend. And now that empire was mine. Natalie continued to sob loudly into her hands, but Richard did not even spare a single glance in his daughter's direction. The absolute panic that had gripped him just moments ago when the board refused to raise their hands was suddenly gone. I watched his posture shift. The desperate cornered animal routine vanished entirely, replaced by a dark, chilling calmness that made the temperature in the sealed boardroom feel as though it had dropped 10 degrees. Richard slowly smoothed the front of his custom suit jacket. A low, bitter chuckle started deep in his chest. The sound was entirely devoid of warmth or humor, echoing harshly against the glass walls of the penthouse suite. It was a terrifying, lethal sound that immediately silenced the panicked murmurs of the older directors sitting around the table. He reached inside the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a remarkably thin, unmarked manila folder. He held it up for a brief second, letting the fluorescent lights catch the edge of the paper before he casually tossed it across the polished mahogany table. It slid smoothly over the wood, stopping exactly an inch from my folded hands. Richard looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. He congratulated me on my brilliant strategy. He told me that I had played an incredible game of chess behind his back. He admitted that I owned the physical building, the intellectual property, and the voting shares of Vanguard Holdings. But then his dark smile widened into a malicious grin. He told me that while I was busy celebrating my hostile takeover, he had spent his weekend preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario. He leaned heavily against the back of his leather chair and informed me that I had just spent millions of dollars to inherit a beautiful, perfectly structured corpse. My eyes darted to the manila folder, but I did not reach out to open it. I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing even a fraction of concern. Richard did not wait for me to read the documents. He proudly announced his scorched earth tactic to the entire room. He explained that late Saturday night, immediately after the humiliating incident at the Waldorf Astoria, he realized his corporate network access was compromised. But I had made one critical miscalculation. While Vanguard Holdings had successfully locked down the domestic enterprise servers, I had not yet severed his emergency executive override codes for the international banking portals. He boasted that he had stayed up until dawn on Sunday morning, systematically accessing the primary operational accounts of the logistics empire. Over the course of 6 hours, he had completely drained every single dollar of our liquid cash reserves. He had wire transferred millions of dollars through a complex maze of shell corporations and deposited the entire sum into highly secure, untraceable offshore trusts located in jurisdictions that do not comply with United States financial subpoenas. The silence in the boardroom shattered instantly. William, the senior director who had just abandoned my father, shot up from his chair. His face was entirely pale as he shouted across the table, demanding to know if Richard had just emptied the corporate treasury. Harrison, another major investor, grabbed his chest and slumped back into his seat, realizing that his massive equity portfolio was now tied to a global logistics company with absolutely zero operating capital. Richard ignored their frantic shouting. He kept his dark, triumphant eyes locked squarely on me. He raised his voice over the chaos of the board members, making sure I heard every single word of his threat. He promised me that without that liquid capital, I would not survive the week. He painted a brutal, realistic picture of the impending collapse. He reminded me that the company had a massive employee payroll due this coming Friday. Thousands of warehouse workers, domestic truck drivers, and international ship captains were expecting their checks. Without the operational funds, the payroll would bounce. The unions would immediately strike. The freight would completely stop moving across the country. Our international supply chain would freeze, and our shipping contracts would be violently breached by Monday morning. Richard laughed again, a harsh and grating sound. He told me that I was going to be sitting in the chief executive officer chair when the federal labor boards and the furious vendors came knocking on the glass doors downstairs. He promised me that the business press would completely destroy my name, painting me as the arrogant daughter who stole her father's company only to bankrupt it in less than 5 business days. At the back of the room, Jamal abruptly stopped his nervous pacing. The terrified scowl he had worn since the failed vote instantly melted away. He pushed himself off the wall and crossed his arms over his broad chest. A wide, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at Natalie, who had stopped crying and was now staring at our father in stunned awe, and gave her a slow, victorious nod. Jamal honestly believed they had just delivered a fatal blow. He thought the Vanguard Empire was destined to burn to the ground, and with it all the evidence of his own financial crimes would be permanently buried in the ashes of a bankrupt company. The boardroom was in total pandemonium. The directors were screaming at Richard, threatening to call the federal authorities, while Richard simply stood there, soaking in the absolute destruction he had caused. He genuinely believed he had me trapped. He thought I would break down, unlock the boardroom doors, and beg him to return the money in exchange for giving him his company back. I did not break. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, listening to the panicked shouting of the wealthy men around me. I let Richard enjoy his fleeting moment of absolute victory. I let Jamal smile his arrogant smile. I waited for the noise to reach a deafening peak before I finally decided it was time to drop the guillotine. I unlocked the heavy magnetic boardroom doors with a single press of the security panel. I did not scream or beg my father to return the stolen capital. I simply pointed toward the glass exit and told Richard, Natalie, and Jamal to get the hell out of my building. Richard swaggered out of the penthouse suite with his head held high, genuinely believing he had delivered a fatal, paralyzing blow. He thought I would be calling him in tears by midnight, begging for a truce. He did not realize that surviving a war of attrition was exactly what I had been built for. The weekend passed in a blur of forensic accounting and crisis management, but Monday morning hit the company like a runaway freight train. Natalie and Jamal did not waste a single second licking their wounds. Instead, they went straight to the wolves in the business press. I was standing in my new office, a cup of black coffee in my hand, watching the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. It was the premier morning financial news network, and sitting right there on the plush studio couch was my sister. Natalie was wearing a modest, conservative beige dress deliberately stripped of her usual flashy designer jewelry to look relatable and entirely innocent. Jamal sat close beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, perfectly playing the role of the devoted, reasonable husband shielding his wife from a nightmare. The television host leaned in, asking about the sudden and shocking leadership change at Vanguard Holdings. Natalie immediately produced perfectly timed theatrical tears. She looked directly into the camera and painted a highly fabricated, deeply vicious picture of me. She told millions of viewers that I was a mentally unstable, deeply greedy spinster who had spent her entire life harboring a toxic jealousy toward the family. She claimed our father was simply trying to enjoy his peaceful retirement when I manipulated complex, predatory legal loopholes to steal the legacy he had built with his bare hands. Jamal chimed in seamlessly. He used his natural aggressive sales charisma to speak directly to the shareholders watching at home. He spun a terrifying narrative warning the public that I was a rogue, bitter accountant who had completely lost her grip on reality and had absolutely no idea how to run a global supply chain. He smoothly assured the market that Richard was doing everything in his legal power to rescue the company from my hostile takeover. The public smear campaign was incredibly vicious, and worse, it was highly effective. The financial market absolutely despises instability and family drama. By the time the opening bell rang on Wall Street, Vanguard Holdings took a sharp, terrifying hit. I watched the live ticker at the bottom of the television screen glow bright red as our stock price plummeted by 12% in a matter of hours. The phones outside my office immediately began ringing off the hook. My newly appointed executive team was in an absolute panic, fielding calls from terrified investors who had just watched my sister cry on national television. But the media circus was just a highly calculated smokescreen. The stock dip was embarrassing, but it was not lethal. Jamal's true attack was happening entirely in the shadows. Jamal had spent the last 7 years as the vice president of sales. He had absolutely zero understanding of operational finance, but he possessed a deep, highly valuable Rolodex of industry contacts and personal relationships with our biggest clients. He knew that Richard had completely drained our operational accounts over the weekend. He knew Vanguard Holdings had no liquid cash to operate the massive fleet of shipping trucks or pay the thousands of warehouse workers. So he went for the jugular. He bypassed the media entirely and started making private direct phone calls to our top 3 logistics clients. These were massive multinational retail conglomerates that served as the primary lifeblood of our supply chain revenue. Jamal leveraged his years of building close relationships on expensive golf courses and at luxury steakhouses. He called the chief procurement officers, directly spreading highly confidential rumors that Vanguard was completely insolvent. He convinced them that I would absolutely not be able to fulfill their international shipping contracts by the end of the week because the company was literally out of money. He did not just scare them away, he actively poached them. Jamal funneled our top 3 clients directly to a rival logistics firm, undoubtedly in exchange for a massive under-the-table kickback to keep his own pockets lined while he waited for my empire to collapse. The resulting damage was swift and catastrophic. By Wednesday afternoon, I sat at my mahogany desk and received 3 separate formal cancellation notices from our biggest accounts. The retail giants were invoking the emergency exit clauses in their contracts, pulling hundreds of millions of dollars in future revenue right out from under me. My vice president of operations rushed into my office, his face slick with cold sweat. He dropped a thick stack of payroll ledgers onto my desk. He did not need to say a single word. I already knew exactly what the numbers meant. Between the plummeting stock price, the devastating loss of our top 3 clients, and the completely empty operational bank accounts, Vanguard Holdings was bleeding out on the table. It was only my first week as the chief executive officer, and the walls were rapidly closing in. The board of directors began calling my private executive line every single hour. The very men who had sat in the boardroom and watched my father drain the accounts were now practically begging me to surrender. They pleaded with me to step down to call Richard and to negotiate a peaceful truce before the entire shipping empire collapsed completely and wiped out their massive retirement portfolios. They wanted me to admit total defeat and hand my father back the keys to the kingdom. Panic was exactly what Richard and Jamal wanted. They wanted to isolate me, humiliate me, and watch me crack under the crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar failure. They expected me to break down and cry. They expected me to admit that I was just the glorified paper pusher my father always claimed I was. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who was actually sitting in the executive chair. I was not a terrified little girl seeking her father's approval anymore. I was the financial architect who had built the very walls they were currently trying to knock down. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, watching the busy Manhattan streets far below. I thought about the thousands of employees who relied on this company for their livelihoods. The warehouse workers, the truck drivers, the administrative staff who had absolutely nothing to do with my family's toxic dysfunction. Richard was willing to destroy all of their lives just to punish me. He was perfectly fine letting innocent people default on their mortgages just so he could regain his inflated billionaire status and feed his own massive ego. That realization burned away any lingering hesitation I might have had. The time for playing defense was officially over. I walked back to my desk, picked up my secure phone line, and called my lead corporate attorney. If my father and brother-in-law wanted to play a scorched earth game to see who would break first, I was going to show them exactly what a real fire looked like. I kept the phone pressed firmly to my ear, watching the chaotic trading floor on the television screen behind me. When my lead corporate attorney answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave him a set of highly specific, aggressive instructions and told him to assemble our entire litigation team in the downtown war room within the hour. By Thursday morning, the executive suite was a complete madhouse. The board of directors had abandoned any pretense of decorum. William and Harrison, the two senior directors who had sat silently while my father drained the corporate treasury, practically broke down my heavy oak door. They barged into my office, their faces pale and slick with cold sweat. They bypassed my assistant, entirely waving printed copies of our plummeting stock evaluations and the devastating cancellation notices from our top retail clients. William slammed his hands down on my mahogany desk, his voice trembling with sheer panic. He begged me to pick up the phone and call Richard. He pleaded with me to offer my father a compromise. He said we needed to give Richard back his 51% voting majority and reinstate Natalie immediately, just to get the stolen operational funds wired back into the domestic accounts before the massive Friday payroll bounced. Harrison chimed in, pacing frantically across my office carpet, claiming that surviving to fight another day was better than letting the entire logistics empire burn to the ground. They wanted me to bow my head, swallow my pride, and surrender to the very men who were actively trying to destroy us. I sat back in my leather executive chair, completely unbothered by their desperate shouting. I let them exhaust themselves before I finally spoke. I looked William dead in the eye and kept my voice perfectly flat and razor sharp. I told him that I absolutely refused to negotiate with financial terrorists. I explained that if we surrendered to Richard's extortion now, we would be setting a precedent that the Vanguard Holdings board could be held hostage every single time my father threw a temper tantrum. I told the directors to sit down, shut up, and watch how a real chief executive officer handles a hostile threat. I turned my computer monitor around so they could see the screen. I pulled up the original heavily encrypted debt contracts that Vanguard Holdings had purchased 3 years ago. I reminded William and Harrison that they had been too busy attending country club galas back then to actually read the fine print of Richard's financial bailout. I broke it down for them with absolute clarity. 3 years ago, when Richard was on the verge of total bankruptcy, no legitimate banking institution was willing to touch his toxic corporate debt. When my private shell company stepped in to save him, I demanded massive ironclad collateral to secure the $85 million loan. Richard was so incredibly desperate for the cash infusion and so arrogantly confident that he would easily pay it back that he personally guaranteed the corporate loans. I clicked a button bringing up the specific addendums of the master agreement. I showed the stunned directors exactly what Richard had signed away. He had legally pledged his sprawling 10-bedroom Connecticut estate as direct collateral. Furthermore, he had pledged his entire prized collection of 12 vintage European sports cars vehicles worth millions of dollars combined. Because Vanguard Holdings now owned that exact debt, Vanguard Holdings legally held the pink slips and the property deed. And because Richard had deliberately sabotaged the company by draining the operational accounts to offshore trusts, he had officially committed gross financial fraud, instantly triggering the maximum penalty clauses in the contract. William and Harrison stared at the screen in absolute silence. The color slowly returned to their faces as they realized what I was about to do. I was not going to play defense. I was going to drop a nuclear bomb on my father's personal life. I did not call my father to argue or plead for my money. I let my legal team do the talking. On Wednesday afternoon, my attorneys had marched directly into federal court. They bypassed the standard civil procedures and filed an immediate aggressive emergency injunction with the presiding federal judge. We did not just claim corporate interference. We presented a mountain of undeniable hard evidence. We provided the court with the exact routing numbers Richard had used to illegally funnel the company payroll to his hidden shell corporations. We showed the judge the payroll ledgers proving with cold hard data that Richard was deliberately sabotaging a major American logistics corporation and putting thousands of innocent employee livelihoods at immediate catastrophic risk. The federal judge took exactly 15 minutes to review the documents. He recognized the severity of the financial sabotage and did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately signed a sweeping court order granting my request for a total uncompromising asset freeze. The court authorized the immediate seizure of all personal property tied to the Vanguard loans to cover the stolen operational funds. By Thursday morning, while the board was begging me to surrender, the trap had already snapped violently shut around my father's ankles. The freeze was instantaneous and absolute. Richard's elite black credit cards were abruptly declined when he tried to buy his morning espresso at a luxury cafe. His private banking app locked him out, flashing bright red security warnings. The massive joint checking accounts he shared with my mother were completely frozen by federal mandate. Every single dollar of domestic liquidity he possessed was instantly trapped behind a wall of federal red tape. He was legally blocked from accessing the stolen offshore funds because transferring that money back into the United States while under an active federal injunction would trigger immediate money laundering charges. He had tried to starve me out by draining my corporate accounts, but I had just successfully completely paralyzed his entire financial existence. My office phone suddenly lit up with a secure call from my lead attorney. I put it on speakerphone so William and Harrison could hear. The attorney's voice was crisp and highly satisfied. He confirmed that the federal orders had been fully processed by the local authorities. The injunction was completely active, and the United States Marshals Service had officially been dispatched to execute the property seizure. I thanked my attorney, ended the call, and looked back at the two senior directors sitting in my office. They were staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, lingering fear. They finally understood that I was not a paper pusher, and I was certainly not someone they could ever manipulate or intimidate. I stood up from my desk, smoothed out my sharp navy suit, and picked up my car keys. I told William to go back to the trading floor and assure the panicked investors that the Friday payroll would be fully funded by tomorrow morning. I informed Harrison that he needed to start drafting press releases about our sudden influx of recovered capital. Harrison swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. He asked me where I was going, considering the company was still technically in the middle of a massive public relations crisis. I gave him a cold, completely unapologetic smile. I told him that I was going for a short drive out to the Connecticut suburbs. My mother was hosting a very important high society luncheon today, and I wanted to make sure I had a front row seat when the federal marshals arrived to collect my property. The drive up the interstate to Connecticut took just under an hour, but to me it felt like a victory lap 10 years in the making. The bright autumn leaves flashed past my tinted windows as I steered my sedan toward the affluent, highly exclusive suburb where I had spent my miserable childhood. I knew every curve of these pristine roads. I knew the exact layout of the sprawling 10-bedroom estate that Richard had bought to showcase his wealth. And I knew exactly how much my mother Patricia valued her flawless reputation among the neighborhood elite. I pulled into the quiet tree-lined street and parked my car flush against the curb directly across from the massive wrought iron gates of the family estate. I killed the engine, rolled down my window just a few inches to let in the crisp afternoon air, and settled in to watch the show. Through the heavy iron bars, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the grand circular driveway and the expansive front terrace. Patricia was in the middle of hosting her highly anticipated autumn high society luncheon. I could see exactly what she was trying to do. With Vanguard Holdings stock plunging and rumors of insolvency dominating the morning business news, Patricia was deploying her only real skill. She was using exorbitant luxury to project an illusion of total stability. She wanted to prove to the country club presidents and the wealthy politicians' wives that the family was completely untouched by the corporate drama. The driveway was packed nose to tail with imported luxury SUVs and sleek European sports cars. Men in crisp white catering jackets were practically sprinting back and forth across the manicured lawn, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and imported hors d'oeuvres. Patricia stood at the center of the terrace, wearing a pristine white designer suit, a string of heavy pearls resting elegantly against her collarbone. She was throwing her head back, in practiced theatrical laughter, holding a crystal flute of champagne, playing the role of the untouchable billionaire matriarch to absolute perfection. She looked so incredibly confident. She had absolutely no idea that her husband had just committed federal financial fraud, and she had no idea that I now held the legal deed to the very ground she was standing on. Precisely at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the tranquil atmosphere of the wealthy neighborhood was violently shattered. A heavy convoy of dark, unmarked government vehicles turned off the main road and aggressively approached the estate. There were 3 massive black SUVs with federal plates followed closely by 2 heavy-duty industrial flatbed tow trucks. They did not stop to press the button on the gold-plated security intercom. The lead SUV rolled right up to the wrought iron gates and 2 federal marshals dressed in dark tactical gear stepped out. They unlocked the heavy electronic mechanism with a master override key and forcefully pushed the massive gates wide open. The entire convoy rolled directly onto the pristine circular driveway, the heavy tires of the tow trucks crushing Patricia's perfectly manicured flower beds. The lively classical music playing from the outdoor speakers was abruptly drowned out by the harsh mechanical grinding of heavy diesel engines. On the terrace, the wealthy guests froze in absolute terror. The elegant laughter died instantly. A dozen federal agents stepped out of their vehicles. They did not shout or draw weapons, but their presence was utterly uncompromising. The lead marshal, holding a thick stack of brightly colored court orders, marched straight up the sweeping stone staircase. Patricia dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered into 100 pieces across the stone patio, the expensive alcohol soaking right into the hem of her pristine white designer suit. I sat comfortably in my car, resting my arm on the doorframe, watching the absolute destruction of my mother's carefully curated universe. The marshals immediately began executing the total asset freeze. 2 agents walked directly past a horrified Patricia and used heavy red tape to affix a massive federal seizure notice straight onto the custom oak front doors of the mansion. Other agents moved methodically across the terrace, slapping bright neon orange seizure stickers onto the imported Italian stone fountains, the luxury patio furniture, and the massive bronze sculptures Richard had bought at auction. The absolute mortification among the luncheon guests was immediate and severe. In these hyper-elite social circles, there is nothing more terrifying or contagious than financial ruin. The women in their designer dresses began scrambling frantically toward the driveway. They completely abandoned their composure, shouting for the panicked valets to bring them their car keys immediately. They wanted to get as far away from Patricia and her federally rated home as humanly possible. Several neighbors from the adjacent mansions had even stepped out onto their own balconies, holding their phones up to record the spectacular downfall of Richard's empire. Then came the final crushing blow. The marshals directed the 2 massive tow trucks toward the climate-controlled 4-car garage at the side of the estate. The heavy bay doors were forced open. I watched as the operators attached thick industrial chains to the undercarriage of Richard's most prized possessions. Slowly, painfully, a vintage 1960s Aston Martin and a custom-ordered Porsche were dragged out of the garage and hoisted onto the flatbeds. The screeching of the tires against the concrete echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street. Patricia was standing entirely alone on the ruined terrace. Her friends had completely abandoned her. Her caterers had packed up their silver trays and fled. She looked around at the federal agents swarming her home, her chest heaving with sheer panic. Then she turned her head and looked past the open iron gates. She spotted my sleek black sedan parked across the street. Even through the tinted glass, she knew exactly who was sitting inside. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 full times, savoring the moment before I calmly pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear. Patricia was completely unhinged. Her refined, elitist country club accent was entirely gone, replaced by a shrill, breathless hysteria that pierced through the speaker. She screamed into the phone, demanding to know what I was doing to her house. She sobbed violently, shouting that armed men were walking through her pristine kitchen and tagging her antique dining table. She accused me of being a monster, wailing that I was purposely humiliating her in front of the entire neighborhood and destroying her social standing forever. I listened to her cry. I listened to the sound of the superficial life she valued far more than her own daughter being dismantled piece by piece. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I kept my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any sympathy or anger. I spoke to her with the cold authority of a landlord evicting a troublesome tenant. I told her that Richard had stolen the money needed to pay the thousands of people who actually worked for a living, so I was simply collecting the collateral he rightfully owed Vanguard Holdings. Patricia shrieked that she had nothing to do with Richard's corporate accounts. She begged me to call the federal marshals off. She pleaded with me to let her keep the house, shifting wildly from vicious anger to pathetic begging in the span of a few seconds. She cried out, asking me where she and Richard were supposed to sleep tonight if the state seized the property. She actually had the audacity to ask me how she could possibly survive being thrown out into the cold. I smiled, remembering a very specific freezing Thanksgiving night in a dark college dormitory 15 years ago. I told Patricia that she should try sleeping on a plastic mattress in a dorm room. I reminded her of her exact words from the boardroom earlier that week. I told her that family comes first, and right now she needed to fully support her husband's terrible financial decisions by sharing in his absolute ruin. Patricia wailed into the receiver, a long, desperate sound of total defeat. She begged me for mercy one last time. I looked at the digital clock on my car's dashboard. I kept my tone incredibly polite and entirely lethal. I told her the sun sets at exactly 6:15 this evening. I advised her to pack whatever designer bags the marshals had not already tagged, gather her husband, and ensure they were entirely off my property before it gets dark. I did not wait for her response. I pressed the red button and the line went completely dead. I rolled up my window, cutting off the sounds of the tow trucks and my mother's sobbing. I shifted my car into drive, pulled smoothly away from the curb, and left my family officially homeless on the sprawling manicured lawn they used to call their own. The sun set on my family's reign over Connecticut high society on Thursday evening. By Friday morning, the reality of their absolute ruin had finally settled into their bones. They had spent the night in a moderately priced airport hotel, stripped of their luxury cars, their sprawling estate, and their endless supply of corporate credit. At exactly 9 o'clock, my private executive line rang. It was not Richard calling to scream at me. It was a senior partner from one of the most ruthless top-tier corporate mediation firms in Manhattan. He formally requested an immediate sit-down. Richard was finally ready to wave a white flag, or at least he thought he was. I arrived at the neutral law firm at noon. I was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, carrying nothing but a single slim leather briefcase. The mediation room was a massive glass box overlooking the city skyline, specifically designed to make people feel small and insignificant. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, the sight before me was almost pitiful. In just 24 hours, the billionaire patriarch and his perfect family had been completely dismantled. Richard sat at the far end of the long conference table. He had aged 10 years overnight. His posture was slumped, and the arrogant aura he usually wore like a second skin was completely gone. His custom suit looked wrinkled, likely because he had slept in it. Patricia sat next to him, wearing dark, oversized sunglasses indoors to hide her swollen, tear-stained eyes. She clutched a cheap paper coffee cup, a stark contrast to the crystal champagne flutes she was holding yesterday. Natalie was staring blankly at the polished wood table, completely stripped of her designer jewelry and her usual confident sneer. Jamal sat a few chairs away from them, his leg bouncing rapidly under the table in a nervous, uncontrollable rhythm. Richard's attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to intimidate people, cleared his throat and slid a thick legal binder across the table toward me. He steepled his fingers and adopted a patronizing, compromising tone. He explained that my father was willing to offer me a generous truce to save the family from further public embarrassment. Richard leaned forward, trying desperately to summon a fraction of his old authoritative voice. He looked at me and laid out his terms. He told me that if I signed the contract his lawyer had just prepared, he would immediately wire the stolen operational funds back into Vanguard Holdings from his untraceable offshore accounts. The Friday payroll would clear, and the supply chain would survive. But in exchange, I had to surrender 51% of the voting shares back to him, guaranteeing his absolute control over the company. Furthermore, I would officially reinstate Natalie as the co-chief executive officer and publicly apologize for the hostile takeover. He glared at me across the table, trying to look dangerous. He stated that if I refused his generous offer, he would drag Vanguard Holdings into a brutal decade-long legal war. He promised to use the millions of dollars he had hidden offshore to hire an army of ruthless litigators. He threatened to file endless appeals, frivolous injunctions, and massive defamation lawsuits that would drain every single cent of my personal wealth and paralyze the logistics empire until we were both completely bankrupt. I looked at the thick legal binder sitting on the glass table. It was a monument to their delusion. They honestly believed that because they had inflicted a few days of corporate stress on me, I was ready to fold. They thought the threat of a long legal battle would terrify me into giving up everything I had rightfully taken. Richard mistook my silence for hesitation. He leaned even closer, tapping his finger aggressively against the glass. He told me that I was a smart girl, but I was entirely out of my depth. He said the business world does not run on righteous anger, it runs on capital. And right now, he was the only one holding the liquid cash to keep the lights on. He painted a grim picture of my future, promising me that I would spend the rest of my 30s buried under mountains of legal discovery, watching my reputation rot in a courtroom while he lived comfortably abroad. Patricia suddenly spoke up, her voice raspy from crying all night. She pulled down her sunglasses slightly and glared at me. She told me to just sign the paper. She said I had made my point, I had ruined her luncheon, and I had humiliated them enough. She demanded that I fix what I had broken so they could go back to their normal lives. Natalie chimed in, her voice shaking with residual anger. She crossed her arms and told me that I was being completely unreasonable. She insisted that she deserved the CEO title because she was the face of the brand, and without her the investors would never fully trust the company anyway. Jamal remained entirely silent, his eyes darting between me and the briefcase resting on my lap, his nervous bouncing leg shaking the entire table. They were all waiting for me to break. The high-powered lawyer checked his expensive watch, clearly expecting this to be a quick, easy surrender. He pushed a heavy gold pen across the glass, pointing exactly to where I needed to sign away my victory. I did not touch the binder. I did not pick up the gold pen. I did not consult with the legal counsel sitting quietly beside me. I simply looked at my father, taking in the pathetic reality of a man who had to resort to extortion to maintain a sliver of power. I took a slow, deep breath, enjoying the absolute quiet of the room, before I finally lifted my slim leather briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the glass table. The twin brass locks on my leather briefcase snapped open with a sharp metallic click that echoed like a gunshot in the pristine, quiet mediation room. I pushed the lid back slowly. Inside, there were no desperate counteroffers. There were no drafted pleas for a family reconciliation. There was only a single thick manila envelope. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He leaned back in his plush chair, crossing his arms over his chest, rolling his eyes as if I were a stubborn child putting on a pointless magic show. He told me that whatever financial projections I had brought in that bag were completely useless without liquid capital. His high-priced attorney sighed loudly, picking up his heavy gold pen and tapping it impatiently against the glass table, clearly signaling that I was wasting his very expensive time. I ignored them both. I reached into the briefcase, lifted the heavy envelope and broke the seal. I pulled out a thick stack of original, unredacted documents. The paper was slightly aged, covered in blue ink signatures, official government stamps, and dense numerical columns. I did not just slide the stack across the table immediately. I picked up the first document, held it up to the natural light pouring in from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and began to read aloud. I read the exact date of a transaction, an offshore routing number, and a declared asset valuation of $30 million. Then I read a second date, a United States Customs declaration, and a severely altered cargo manifest that systematically erased heavy international shipping tariffs for a massive shipment of electronics. Richard stopped breathing. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face so fast, it looked as though he had been physically struck by an invisible force. I kept my voice crystal clear, projecting it so that every single person in the room understood the exact gravity of the situation. I explained that 3 years ago, when I was desperately untangling the massive web of toxic debt that was about to bankrupt Vanguard Holdings, I demanded absolute unrestricted access to the corporate archives. Richard had been so panicked about losing his billionaire status at the time that he handed me the master keys to the basement vault without a second thought. He assumed I was just going to balance the checkbook and restructure his terrible real estate loans. He had completely forgotten what else he had buried down there in the dark. I laid the first document flat on the glass table and pushed it directly toward his high-powered attorney. I told the room that I did not just find evidence of bad investments and poor market timing. I found the raw, highly illegal ledgers proving Richard had actively committed massive, deliberate federal tax evasion. To hide his catastrophic financial losses from the board of directors, he had created phantom offshore entities to launder the company revenue. But he did not stop there. The logistics empire relied on moving heavy freight across international borders. To save money and artificially inflate our profit margins, my father had systematically forged United States Customs documents. He had faked government seals to bypass millions of dollars in federal tariffs. The attorney leaned forward, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance, and glanced down at the paper. It took exactly 10 seconds for all the arrogant color to completely drain from his face. I pulled out a second document, sliding it right next to the first. I pointed to the blue ink at the bottom of the page. I stated clearly that these were not sanitized copies. These were the original, unredacted documents containing Richard's authentic signature. I told the attorney that he was currently looking at irrefutable hard evidence of severe federal crimes. Forging government customs documents and defrauding the Internal Revenue Service on this massive scale did not result in a gentle slap on the wrist or a simple corporate fine negotiated over a round of golf. These offenses carried mandatory minimum prison sentences of 20 years in federal penitentiaries. The lawyer immediately dropped his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the thick glass table. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor, physically distancing himself from my father. He looked at Richard with wide, horrified eyes. A corporate lawyer of his caliber knew exactly what a federal indictment looked like, and he knew instantly that this case was completely indefensible. He closed his expensive leather notebook, stood up, and stated with absolute clarity that he could not and would not represent a client who was actively engaged in criminal fraud against the federal government. He grabbed his briefcase and moved toward the corner of the room, effectively abandoning his client on the spot. Richard lunged forward, his hands trembling violently as he grabbed the papers off the table. He stared at his own forged signatures, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning in plain sight. He flipped frantically through the pages, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror as he recognized the damning ledgers he thought he had successfully destroyed years ago. He realized that while he was plotting to drain the operational accounts, I had been holding a loaded gun to his head for 3 entire years, just waiting for him to give me a reason to pull the trigger. Patricia let out a horrified, muffled gasp, burying her face in her manicured hands. The cheap paper coffee cup she had been holding tipped over, spilling lukewarm brown liquid across the polished glass. But she did not even notice the mess ruining her designer sleeve. She finally realized that the nightmare was not just about losing her country club membership or being evicted from her sprawling estate. Her husband was going to be locked in a federal prison cell for the rest of his natural life, and her reputation would be permanently destroyed by a national criminal scandal. Natalie whipped her head back and forth between our father and the scattered documents. She did not understand the complex legal jargon or the mechanics of customs fraud, but she perfectly understood the absolute panic radiating from the men in the room. Her voice was shrill and completely breathless as she asked Richard what I was talking about. She grabbed his arm, shaking him roughly, demanding that he tell the lawyer I was lying. She screamed at him to fix it, terrified that her own lavish lifestyle was about to be tied to a federal investigation. Richard could not speak to her. He could not even look at her. He just stared at the documents, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, his perfectly constructed billionaire persona shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass table, and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. I told him that his threat of a decade-long civil litigation was completely meaningless to me now. I explained that we were no longer operating in the civilized realm of corporate mediation or family disputes. We were sitting squarely in the unforgiving territory of the Department of Justice. I informed him that if he did not immediately accept my terms of unconditional surrender, I would not waste my time filing a civil countersuit. I would simply stand up, walk out of this glass room, and hand this exact manila envelope directly to the federal prosecutors waiting at the district attorney's office just 3 blocks away. The absolute silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I watched the last remaining ounce of fight completely leave his body. The great patriarch, the man who had publicly humiliated me and called me a useless shame to the family, physically shrank in his chair. He was trapped, cornered, and entirely at my mercy. The absolute silence that followed the departure of Richard's attorney hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Richard was entirely paralyzed, his eyes glued to the forged government seals that were about to end his life as a free man. Patricia continued to weep softly into her hands, the reality of her shattered social standing and her husband's impending incarceration fully breaking her spirit. But it was Jamal who finally broke the quiet. Jamal had spent his entire career reading the room, assessing risks, and closing aggressive deals. He looked at the tax fraud documents scattered across the glass table, then looked at the defeated, broken posture of his father-in-law. The calculation in Jamal's eyes was cold, rapid, and immediate. He realized with absolute certainty that Vanguard Holdings was no longer just a sinking ship. It was a submarine that had just imploded at the bottom of the ocean, and Richard was permanently chained to the hull. Jamal abruptly pushed his heavy leather chair back. The legs screeched loudly against the polished hardwood floor, startling Natalie so badly she physically jumped in her seat. Jamal did not look at his wife, he did not look at Richard. He stepped away from his family entirely and turned his body toward me, holding his hands up in a placating, defensive gesture. His charismatic salesman mask was completely shattered, replaced by a raw, frantic desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard and loudly declared that he had absolutely nothing to do with the customs fraud or the tax evasion. He stated for the record, speaking directly to me and the empty chairs in the room, that he was strictly the vice president of sales. He swore he had never seen those offshore tax ledgers and had zero knowledge of the forged cargo manifests moving across the international borders. Natalie stared at her husband in absolute horror. Her voice trembled as she called his name, reaching a manicured hand out toward his arm. Jamal practically swatted her hand away. He took another step toward my side of the glass table, completely abandoning the woman he had vowed to protect. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes and launched into his final desperate pitch. He offered me a deal. He promised to become the star witness for the federal prosecution. He told me that he knew exactly which executives had helped Richard facilitate the international wire transfers. He knew where the hidden shell corporation servers were physically located. He offered to testify against my father in open court, to hand over every single piece of corporate communication he possessed, and to completely destroy whatever was left of Richard's legal defense. All he wanted in exchange was a clean exit. He begged me to let him keep his executive severance package. He pleaded with me to bury the silver flash drive containing the proof of his own embezzlement, promising he would walk away from Vanguard Holdings, walk away from Natalie, and never show his face in the logistics industry again. He tried to smile a pathetic wavering attempt at his old charm and told me we could help each other win. Natalie screamed his name again. This time, it was a gut-wrenching sound of total devastation. In the span of a single week, she had lost her chief executive officer title, her massive trust fund, her sprawling childhood estate, and now her husband was actively offering to put her father in federal prison just to save his own skin. She sobbed hysterically, burying her face in her hands, calling him a traitor and a coward. I let Jamal finish his pathetic presentation. I let him stand there breathless and terrified, waiting for me to accept his ultimate betrayal. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply looked at him with a cold, unyielding stare. I slowly shook my head. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any mercy. I told Jamal that his offer was incredibly generous, but I simply did not need his testimony. I gestured to the unredacted documents sitting on the table. I reminded him that Richard's authentic signatures were already on the fraudulent customs declarations. The paper trail was absolute. My father was not going to let this go to trial because there was no defense left to mount. I watched the desperate hope drain entirely from Jamal's face. I continued driving the final nail into his coffin. I addressed his request for a clean exit and his severance package. I informed him that he was approximately 48 hours too late to negotiate. I calmly explained that on Wednesday afternoon, while my legal team was busy securing the emergency injunction to freeze the family estate, I had taken a brief detour. I had personally couriered the silver flash drive directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the District Attorney's Office. I told Jamal that I had provided them with the exact routing numbers of his offshore accounts, the dates of his fake vendor invoices, and crystal clear proof that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the logistics department. Jamal froze. His broad shoulders slumped and his eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. He stammered, taking a staggering step backward, demanding to know what I had done. He breathed heavily, shaking his head in rapid denial, muttering that I could not possibly have given the drive to the authorities without using it as leverage first. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my navy suit jacket and looked down at my gold wristwatch. I watched the second hand sweep across the dial. Right on cue, the faint wailing sound of police sirens drifted up from the busy Manhattan streets below. The sound grew louder and more urgent by the second, bouncing off the surrounding skyscrapers and echoing right through the heavy glass windows of the mediation room. I looked back up at my brother-in-law. I suggested that he might want to take the elevator down to the lobby immediately because the authorities generally do not like to be kept waiting. Jamal turned completely white. The reality of his impending arrest crashed into him with the force of a physical blow. He practically stumbled backward over his chair, turning around and sprinting out of the glass mediation room in a blind, animalistic panic. He threw the heavy glass doors open, not even looking back at the family he had just tried to sell out. We all sat in absolute silence, listening to his heavy footsteps pounding frantically down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators. Natalie buried her face in her arms, weeping uncontrollably on the polished wood table. 2 minutes later, my secure executive phone chimed loudly in the quiet room. It was a text message from my new head of security, who had been waiting downstairs. I picked up the phone, read the message, and set it back down on the glass. I looked directly at my father, who was still staring blankly at the tax fraud documents. I told the room that Jamal had just been intercepted in the main lobby. He did not make it out the front doors. He was currently being handcuffed in front of the law firm reception desk by 4 uniformed police officers, and he was being escorted to a squad car to face multiple felony charges for corporate embezzlement. The room fell profoundly still. The billionaire patriarch was ruined. The golden child was shattered. The charismatic son-in-law was in police custody. and the daughter they had all branded a useless shame was sitting calmly at the table, holding the absolute power of their entire futures in the palm of her hand. The heavy silence in the mediation room was finally broken by a sound I had never heard in my entire 35 years of life. My father, the untouchable billionaire, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting absolute dominance, began to weep. It was not a dignified, quiet display of sorrow. It was a pathetic, ugly, completely visceral breakdown. His broad shoulders heaved violently under his wrinkled custom suit. He buried his face in his trembling hands, and a loud, guttural sob ripped from his throat. The sound echoed off the cold glass walls, entirely devoid of the booming authority he had weaponized against me at the Waldorf Astoria just 1 week ago. He cried for his lost empire, for his destroyed legacy, and most of all, he cried for himself, terrified of the federal prison cell that was currently waiting for him at the bottom of a manila envelope. Patricia did not reach out to comfort him. She sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the spilled coffee on the glass table, completely paralyzed by the realization that her husband's arrogance had finally cost them everything. She did not shed a tear for the daughter she had alienated, or the son-in-law who had just been dragged out in handcuffs. She only mourned the sudden violent death of her high society status. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I watched my father cry with the objective curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. After a few minutes, when his loud sobs devolved into breathless, pathetic gasping, I reached into my leather briefcase one last time. I pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal contracts bound together by a heavy black clip. I dropped the stack squarely in the center of the table, right on top of the forged customs documents. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I told Richard that he had exactly two choices. He could continue to sit there and cry while I called the district attorney upstairs to collect the fraud evidence, or he could pick up the gold pen his lawyer had left behind and sign his name on every single dotted line. I laid out the terms of his total unconditional surrender with absolute clarity. The contract mandated the immediate and permanent transfer of all his remaining equity and voting rights to Vanguard Holdings. It legally dissolved his position on the board of directors and stripped him of his founder title entirely. It authorized the immediate repatriation of the stolen offshore funds back into the domestic operational accounts. Furthermore, it included a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. If he or Patricia ever spoke to the press, attempted to publish a memoir, or uttered a single negative word about me or my company in public, the agreement stipulated massive financial penalties and gave me the absolute right to unseal the tax fraud documents and hand them directly to the federal government. Richard looked up at me, his eyes completely bloodshot tears streaming down his flushed, aged face. He opened his mouth perhaps to ask for a small monthly stipend or to beg for a sliver of dignity, but he saw the completely unyielding expression on my face and swallowed his words. His hands shook so violently that he could barely grip the heavy gold pen. He pulled the legal binder toward him. He did not read the terms. He did not ask for clarification from the lawyer who had already abandoned him. He simply turned the pages, his tears literally spotting the crisp white paper, and signed his name over and over again. He signed away his legacy. He signed away his wealth. He signed away his entire identity, just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. When he reached the final page, he dropped the pen. It rolled across the glass table and fell to the floor with a hollow clatter. He slumped forward, resting his head against the cold glass, entirely defeated. I pulled the signed contracts toward me, verifying every signature before carefully placing them back into my briefcase. The war was officially over. I snapped the brass locks shut and stood up from my chair. That is when Natalie finally moved. She had been sitting in a state of absolute shock since Jamal ran out of the room. But as I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door, the reality of her new existence suddenly crashed down on her. Her husband was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser facing years in prison for embezzlement. Her father was broke and utterly powerless. Her massive trust fund, which was tied entirely to the Vanguard equity Richard had just signed away, was completely gone. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and absolutely no way to fund the lavish lifestyle she believed was her birthright. Natalie pushed her chair back and scrambled to her feet. She stumbled around the edge of the glass table, placing herself directly between me and the heavy glass doors. Her perfect manicured facade was completely destroyed. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and her designer clothes looked entirely out of place on a woman who had just lost everything. She reached out her hands shaking and desperately grabbed the sleeve of my navy suit jacket. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of the arrogant sneer she had used to belittle me my entire life. She begged me to wait. She sobbed openly, pleading with me not to leave her with nothing. She rapidly backpedaled on every hateful thing she had said on national television just 2 days prior. She claimed she had been manipulated by Jamal and brainwashed by our father. She cried that she had no money for rent, no way to pay her massive credit card bills, and no idea how to survive in the real world. Then the ultimate golden child did something I never thought I would witness. She begged me for a job. She promised she would do anything I asked. She offered to work in the mailroom to fetch coffee for the executive team to be my personal assistant. She pleaded for a low-level entry position, just a basic salary to keep her off the streets, swearing that she would be the most loyal employee Vanguard Holdings had ever seen. I stopped and looked down at her hands frantically gripping my sleeve. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I did not waste my breath reminding her that she had stood on a stage a week ago and gladly accepted my completely unearned termination. I reached over firmly, grabbed her wrists, and slowly peeled her fingers off my jacket. I looked directly into her terrified, desperate eyes. I did not say a single word. The silence was the loudest, most absolute rejection I could possibly deliver. I stepped around her, pushed the heavy glass doors open, and walked out of the mediation room. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, stepped into the waiting elevator, and left my entirely broken family behind me forever. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the law firm and onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk. The late afternoon sun washed over the city, and for the first time in 10 agonizing years, I felt the suffocating weight of my family's fabricated empire completely lift from my shoulders. I took a long, deep breath of the crisp autumn air. I did not look back up at the towering skyscraper where I had just left my father crying over his ruined legacy. I hailed a passing black car and directed the driver straight back to the Vanguard Holdings corporate headquarters. The war with my family was officially over, but the real work of rebuilding the company was just beginning. By Monday morning, the international wire transfers had fully cleared the complex maze of federal oversight. The millions of dollars Richard had stolen and hidden in his offshore accounts were deposited securely back into our domestic operational treasury. The massive Friday payroll had cleared without a single issue. The international supply chain kept moving, and the immediate financial crisis was entirely averted. But simply having cash in the bank was not enough. The deep systemic rot inside the company still needed to be violently excised. I spent my entire second week as chief executive officer, acting as an absolute corporate grim reaper. Richard had spent decades stacking the executive suite with his wealthy country club buddies and sycophantic loyalists. These were arrogant men who collected massive six-figure salaries to play golf on Wednesday afternoons and take 3-hour martini lunches, while the underpaid middle management actually ran the logistics network. I systematically called them into my penthouse office one by one. I did not offer them compromises, graceful exits, or generous golden parachutes. I handed them immediate non-negotiable termination notices. When the vice president of operations, the very man who had panicked and begged me to surrender to my father just days prior, tried to argue his irreplaceable value to the company, I simply slid his dismal performance metrics across the desk and pointed to the door. By Friday afternoon, the entire top floor had been completely purged of Richard's toxic enablers. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of nepotism, incompetence, and unearned arrogance was entirely scrubbed clean from the building. With the dead weight finally gone and the corporate books meticulously clean, I had the operational agility to do exactly what my father never could. Before his spectacular arrest, Jamal had successfully poached our top 3 domestic clients by spreading vicious rumors of our impending insolvency. I did not waste a single second of my time trying to win back companies that had abandoned us at the very first sign of trouble. Instead, I set my sights on a massive multinational e-commerce conglomerate based in Berlin. Richard had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to land their European shipping contract. He had repeatedly failed because he relied exclusively on flashy dinners, expensive gifts, and empty promises instead of actual logistical infrastructure. I took a completely different approach. I flew to Germany accompanied by my newly promoted, highly competent data analytics team. We did not take the foreign executives to a luxury steakhouse or a private golf course. We brought them directly into a stark, brightly lit boardroom and presented cold, irrefutable data. I showed them the proprietary supply chain algorithms I had been developing in secret for years, the exact same sophisticated systems Richard had arrogantly deemed too boring to implement. I proved mathematically how Vanguard Holdings could reduce their international shipping delays by 18% while simultaneously cutting their baseline fuel costs. The German executives were absolutely stunned by the sheer efficiency, intelligence, and transparency of our new operation. We walked out of that building with a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar exclusive contract. In a single afternoon of merit-based negotiation, I completely replaced the revenue Jamal had stolen and multiplied it by 10. When I returned to New York, the transformation inside the corporate headquarters was absolutely undeniable. The business press, which had eagerly painted me as a hysterical, greedy spinster just weeks prior, suddenly changed their tune entirely. The financial networks were now calling me a brilliant corporate strategist and a ruthless visionary. Vanguard Holdings stock completely rebounded, shattering previous records and climbing higher than it ever had under Richard's deeply flawed leadership. But the most profound change was the one happening inside our own walls. Under my father's rule, Vanguard Holdings had been a toxic kingdom built on fear, favoritism, and blind loyalty to a fragile male ego. Employees had been terrified to speak up report errors or propose innovative ideas because any deviation from Richard's archaic methods was severely and publicly punished. I completely dismantled that poisonous culture overnight. I instituted a strictly merit-based promotion system. I elevated the brilliant, hardworking managers who had been trapped in the basement cubicles for years, giving them the executive titles and the massive salaries they actually deserved. I fired the executives who stole credit and rewarded the quiet workhorses who actually kept the engines running. The frosted glass walls of the penthouse suite were no longer a barrier designed to keep the workers out. The office buzzed with genuine electric energy. We were leaner, vastly more efficient, and incredibly profitable. We were no longer burning millions of dollars to maintain a fleet of luxury corporate jets or funding endless vanity projects for an incompetent family. Every single dollar of profit was reinvested directly back into the technology and the dedicated people who actually made the company thrive. Walking across the busy trading floor, I saw employees smiling, collaborating, and operating without the constant looming dread of an unpredictable dictator. I had not just saved the company from bankruptcy. I had fundamentally resurrected it from the inside out, completely severing the toxic roots of my past to build an empire that reflected my own uncompromising values of hard work, accountability, and absolute integrity. Exactly 1 year has passed since the day I locked the boardroom doors and forced my father to sign away his fraudulent empire. Today, the penthouse suite of Vanguard Holdings looks entirely different. The heavy, dark mahogany furniture Richard loved so much has been replaced with clean, modern lines and bright, open spaces. The air in the executive suite is no longer thick with paranoia, manufactured drama, and toxic competition. It is light, productive, and filled with the quiet hum of genuine success. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, holding a warm cup of black coffee, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. We just closed our third consecutive quarter with record-breaking profits. The board of directors, the same men who once begged me to surrender to my father, now practically trip over themselves to unanimously approve my international expansion proposals. I take a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the comforting warmth spread through my chest. I look down at the busy city streets far below. From this incredible height, the yellow taxis and rushing pedestrians look like tiny, insignificant dots. But my eyes catch a highly familiar, distinctively defeated posture waiting at the crosswalk directly across the avenue. It is Richard. He is no longer wearing custom-tailored Italian silk. He is wearing a cheap, off-the-rack gray suit that hangs loosely on his aging frame. His shoulders are hunched against the brisk wind, and he clutches a scuffed synthetic leather briefcase. He looks exhausted, entirely stripped of the arrogant billionaire swagger he relied on for 35 years. He narrowly avoided a federal prison sentence by surrendering his assets and signing my non-disclosure agreement, but the government still hit him with massive financial penalties for his financial irregularities. To pay his rent on a modest apartment, the former logistics king is now forced to work as a low-level freelance consultant for a minor, struggling regional shipping firm. I watch him shuffle across the street and push his way through the revolving doors of a dated office building. A quiet, knowing smile touches my lips. What Richard does not know is that resting right on my desk, waiting for my final signature, is a massive corporate acquisition contract. For the past 2 months, Vanguard Holdings has been aggressively negotiating a total buyout of that exact regional shipping firm. The ink will dry by next Tuesday. When the public announcement goes live, Richard will walk into his cramped cubicle and discover that Vanguard Holdings has just swallowed his new employer whole. He will suddenly realize that no matter where he goes in this industry, he will always be standing squarely in my shadow. I do not even plan to fire him. I will simply let the standard corporate restructuring efficiently eliminate his obsolete consulting department. I turn away from the window and walk back to my desk. I do not feel a single spark of anger or bitterness toward him anymore. There is no lingering desire for revenge because there is absolutely nothing left to avenge. I only feel a profound, unshakable peace. For the first 3 decades of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just fixed enough of their mistakes, my family would finally love and respect me. I allowed myself to be the designated scapegoat, absorbing their toxic dysfunction so they could maintain their perfect illusions. But I finally learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all. Family is not defined by shared DNA or a common last name. Family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the consistent choice to prioritize one another's well-being. My parents and my sister never saw me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a resource to be exploited and discarded the moment I stopped being useful. I had to make the terrifying decision to cut off the rot, to sever the diseased branches of my family tree, so that my own life could finally have the sunlight it needed to bloom. Walking away from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally is the hardest thing a person can ever do. It goes against everything society teaches us about family loyalty. But loyalty should never be a one-way street leading directly to your own destruction. Sometimes the only way to find your true worth is to completely walk away from the people who are absolutely determined to undervalue you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to create strict boundaries with toxic relatives? Have you ever had to walk away from people who underestimated your potential to finally step into your own power? I would love to hear your stories of survival and success in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, overcoming betrayal, and finding your true worth. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that walking away from a toxic environment is not a failure, it is the ultimate victory. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, your value is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it.